we were going to talk a little bit about our weeks, and I had a very interesting experience a week ago. I took part in an improvised comedy show, and we'll talk about that in a second. We'll move on from there to talking about the new Steve Coogan show, The Trip, and maybe also he's back with some Alan Partridge, some brand new stuff on YouTube there. That's right. And then segue very nicely from our talk of comedy into a very exciting interview. Luke, who have you interviewed this week?
None other than Mr. Stephen Fry.
Very exciting. Who, he's always a busy man, Mr. Fry. Constant seasons of QI, but it was his recent biography as well, I think, which you were grilling him on a little bit there, if that's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, so yes, one thing I alluded to before, which was I took part in a professional comedy show. Well, I say professional. That's a bald-faced lie. It was very little professional about it. But I've been, as a sort of a hobby outside of my teaching, I've been taking for the last 9 weeks. I've been taking these classes, improvised comedy classes at the Upright Citizens Brigade Theatre, which is it's a place in Los Angeles which has produced a lot of comedians who I think we both enjoy, and it really has a speciality in improvised comedy. There's sketch shows and stand-up shows there as well, but improv is kind of what they were known for. And so I've been doing this for several weeks, and straight away there are a few things, I guess, within the group dynamic which singled me out as a little bit different. Number one was that I'm the only person in this group who is not a professional actor, and
wow.
So I was doing this as a hobby, but everyone else there was an actor. Some who were fresh off the bus and had literally been there for 2 weeks, and this is pretty much their first action. Others who had a good 20 years under their belts and are just sort of trying different things, which I've got to applaud. I mean, I've come to see now that this is a lifestyle I would certainly never want to inflict on myself. But at least, I think that's a really positive thing, is if you're trying to train and trying to gain new skills there. I think it did take the pressure off for me a little bit there. But basically we have our training, and we learn these certain skills and certain structures. And then at the end we have a 1 hour improvised show, which starts with a suggestion from the audience of a word, and we were warned that the word is 90% of the time it's a type of food. So sure enough, the first suggestion was fish, which that was the other group. So we're split in two groups. So I was waiting and watching during the first half hour, and then ours was Motown, which actually gave me a bit more to go on, gave us all. And then what happens is we have somebody steps forward and does a monologue, does 3 minutes of, well, the word Motown or the word fish reminds me of this experience which I had, and then they try and narrate an experience with as much detail as possible. And well, for Motown, I think to begin with, it started with just a description of driving around Detroit and how run down it was, and just sort of being glad that the first monologist didn't live there. And then from there we've had the monologue, and we just launch into some scenes. So we had a couple of scenes of driving around, a road trip around decrepit towns in America. And then, so meanwhile, I'm standing on the back line, and I'm thinking I've got to step forward and I've got to take part in a scene, because the worst thing you can do is be standing there the whole time and not say anything. That defeats the entire point, especially as I'd been, lucky enough to have, I'd say, about 7 or 8 people who I know in the audience there who were, I'm sure, expecting something from me. So I took the next scene, I stepped forward, and you see, I've got to confess I'm a bit of a cheat on this, because the whole idea of the improv is somebody steps forward, someone has a line, and you respond with yes, and. So you always agree with what they say, and then you always add something to kind of shape the scene a little bit. And I'm a little bit terrified of being the person who has to think on my feet and form my character. I'd much rather be plotting while someone else is speaking in a previous scene and go in with like a ready-made character, which goes against everything that you do in improv. But I did this.
Yes, and that's completely understandable though, Ollie.
Well, thank you. Bless you, Luke there. But so I jumped forward, and our first item was immediately I was the mayor of Detroit, and I'd had a term, and everything was going terribly in the city, and everything was going to be blamed on me. And I was talking to my chief of staff and trying to show how panicked I was about getting reelected. And I had to say all of this to a person, which would give them enough to go on and enough to yes and bring something else to the scene, but which, was made it very clear that this was the scene we were playing, you see. So
Yep.
I got through that one. I was pleased enough. Once the laughs started coming, it was good. And, people are forgiving, I think, if they know it's an improvised comedy show. And they were, some of the phrases I was saying, I suppose, if I was thinking about it on the ride home, I could have phrased a little better, but I was pleased. But this was one of the things which I noticed is that if you're in this show, which seems to be, 8 weeks ago, I would have been completely terrified by it, and I was terrified stepping out there at the time. But there are ways in which you can prepare little bits. And in fact, I would have to say my biggest laugh, I guess, of the day was a bit which I kind of had seen the opening for about 2 minutes before. So basically what happened then was we had a couple of scenes, and I stepped forward for the second monologue because I wanted to get a nice bit of speaking there. And we were talking about Motown. I talked about a Michael Jackson gig, which I went to with my sister at Wembley Stadium in 1991, where as soon as we got through the gates, my sister took off to the stage, left me behind. And so I was sat there in the stalls right at the back, watching Criss Cross and feeling very sorry for myself.
Are you jumping?
I wasn't, I'm afraid. That wasn't a part of my emotional makeup right then. So, yes, we did that. And then there was a scene which two other improvers started, which was enjoyable. It was I think the starting line was, "Well, I'm sorry, Johnny, but as your principal, I just don't think your Michael Jackson costume is appropriate for Halloween." So that's a great start scene because it gives you, like a place. Both people know who they are. It's got, who, why, or where. It's great. And immediately I thought, I see what the gimmick of this scene is. Bad taste Halloween costume. So I was just standing there on the back line, listening, but really just waiting for my opportunity to knock on the door as another bad taste Halloween costume. And I had about 2 minutes to think. And so I was thinking, okay, who can I be? You see, my first thought was Gary Glitter. And then I had to...
That's uncanny. That was the thought that popped into my head just now. My
there
gosh.
We go. Well,
like-minded men, audience. What can I say?
What more proof needed there? That was my first thought. I rejected that because from experience of glitter-based conversations in the States, he has a very limited recognition. Because, as is evidenced by the fact that his Rock and Roll Part 1 is still very popularly used at all sporting events. But so I went through Gary Glitter. Obviously, anything too British, Raoul Moat is out. So eventually, there was a little bit of a lull in the scene. I stepped forward. I rapped on an imaginary door. It was answered. And I said, "Hi, Principal. Someone sent me up here because they didn't like my Timothy McVeigh costume."
Nice.
There we go. Oh, well, thank you, man. It was strange because I think that, fine, it's I guess a decent line, reference to Oklahoma City bomber, but there was the laugh was a lot bigger for that moment than I thought it would be. It was almost kind of like a sort of explosive laugh because there had been a real lull in the scene between the two of them, and this was kind of a laugh of relief, a laugh of kind of, finally there's like a new piece of energy entered into the scene. And actually the guy who was editing the scene just chose to like black out at that point, and it was a nicely ended scene. But it's nice how, even in what seems to be like a completely improvised show there, then you can still do a fair share of preparation.